right now, tonight, 12 people are sitting in a room in Plymouth County, Massachusetts, arguing over whether a mother who strangled her 3 children with exercise bands should spend the rest of her life in prison or in a psychiatric hospital. Cameras outside that courthouse are pointed at the wrong door. Reporters outside that courthouse are asking the wrong question, because almost nobody talking about this case is asking the one question that might matter more than either of those outcomes. Why is the exact same medical system that failed to stop this now being sued by both people who lost the most that day? Not one lawsuit from one grieving side, quietly filed and forgotten. 2. Running side by side, filed within days of each other by 2 people who will never agree on almost anything else about what happened in that house. This is the trial of Lindsay Clancy. On January 24th, 2023, in the family's home in Duxbury, Massachusetts, Clancy strangled her 3 children, Cora, 5 years old, Dawson, 3 years old, and Callan, 8 months old, before cutting her own neck and wrists and jumping from a second-story window. She survived, paralyzed from the fall. She has pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, and her legal position established through her attorney and never contested by her own defense is that she is not criminally responsible because of a psychotic break tied to postpartum psychiatric illness. She has not been convicted of anything. Everything I'm about to walk you through about the medical decisions made in the months before those children died is drawn from sworn testimony, from court filings, and from 2 civil lawsuits that are now a matter of public record, and any opinion I share about what any of it means is mine alone, not a legal conclusion. Closing arguments wrapped up today. The jury has 5 options on the verdict slip for each child. Not guilty. Not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of second-degree murder. Guilty of manslaughter. 5 boxes, 3 children, and a room full of strangers who have to check 1 box each and live with it. The prosecutor, Jennifer Sprague, spent her closing argument hammering one detail in particular, that Clancy was a labor and delivery nurse, someone who understood exactly what medication was supposed to do to a body, and who, in Sprague's words, wanted to get better on her own terms instead of following what her providers told her. It's a clean argument. It's the kind of argument that fits neatly on a verdict slip. It's also, I think, missing something enormous, something that never makes it onto a verdict slip because a verdict slip only has room for one person's name on it. Because here's the number that keeps sitting with me. 9 separate psychiatric medications prescribed to Lindsay Clancy in the months leading up to January 24th. 8 of them inside a single 3-week stretch. Not over a year. Not gradually, one drug swapped out slowly for another while a doctor watched and waited. 8 different drugs, 3 weeks, 1 deteriorating woman. Say that out loud and it doesn't sound like careful medicine. It sounds like guesswork under pressure, decisions made fast because the patient in front of them kept getting worse and nobody had time to slow down and ask why. That number doesn't come from a true crime commentator with a theory. It comes from Lindsay Clancy's own medical malpractice lawsuit, a civil complaint she filed against the providers who treated her, separate from the criminal case, sitting in the court record right now while a jury decides whether she goes to prison. Let's go back to how this started because the beginning of this story doesn't look anything like the ending of it. Clancy gave birth to Callan, her 3rd child, in August of 2022. According to her own civil complaint, she'd had some anxiety after her 2nd child, but after Callan, something sharper set in. Racing thoughts, an obsessive need to declutter the house, a constant uncomfortable pressure to stay in motion. A psychiatrist offered her an antidepressant around that time. She turned it down because she was breastfeeding and worried about what it might do to the baby. I want you to notice that detail, really sit with it, because it gets lost in everything that follows. That's not the decision of someone who doesn't care what happens to her children. That's someone trying to be careful, weighing her own discomfort against her baby's safety and choosing the baby. By September, careful wasn't holding. Clancy started seeing a psychiatrist named Dr. Jennifer Tufts. Between September and January, Tufts saw her 14 times, 14 visits. That's not a quick consult, that's an ongoing relationship, the kind where you'd expect a provider to build a real picture of what's happening in someone's life, to know the shape of her days and the people around her. And according to testimony, Tufts built that picture almost entirely from what Clancy told her in the room. She spoke to Clancy's husband, Patrick, exactly one time in December. She never spoke to Clancy's parents at all. A woman spiraling through worsening insomnia and thoughts she herself described as intrusive was being evaluated almost entirely through her own self-reporting, with nobody who watched her daily life ever brought into the conversation. Nobody to say, this isn't like her, or she hasn't slept in days, or something is different this week. In November, a nurse practitioner named Julie Paul prescribed Clancy Prozac. Within days, Clancy was already asking to switch to something else. That pattern repeated itself over and over through the following weeks. Trazodone, Ambien, Remeron, Klonopin, Seroquel, Valium, drug after drug layered on top of each other as her symptoms kept shifting, and nobody seemed to be able to get ahead of any of it. 6 different medications in that list alone, stacked on top of the Prozac, stacked on top of whatever was already circulating from the week before. Each swap looks in isolation like a reasonable clinical response to a patient who wasn't improving. Lined up end to end in the space of 3 weeks, it reads less like a treatment plan and more like a team throwing options at a wall to see which one would hold. Now here's where it gets genuinely hard to sit with. At no point in that entire stretch, 14 visits with a psychiatrist, multiple prescribers, 8 medications inside 3 weeks, did anyone order a blood test? Not one. No blood work to see what was already in her system before adding another drug on top of it. No thyroid panel, which is one of the most basic screens for a new mother presenting with mood and cognitive symptoms. It's the kind of test a family doctor might run for someone complaining of fatigue, and nobody ran it for a woman being handed a new psychiatric medication almost every few days. A forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Condy, who reviewed Clancy's full record, criticized her providers directly for never running blood or thyroid testing. Another psychiatrist who testified, Dr. Avram Mack, said under questioning that he didn't recall seeing any record that her providers ever drew blood to check how she was reacting to what she'd been prescribed. And during her hospitalization at McLean Hospital, blood was in fact drawn. It just was never evaluated for medication levels, drawn, and then, as far as the record shows, left unread for the one thing that might have mattered most. A psychiatrist there, Dr. Aaliyah Goodhart, explained why, and I want to be fair to her because this isn't a fringe opinion in her field. She told the court that psychiatry isn't based on blood tests, it's based on the patient sitting in front of you. I've covered a lot of cases, and I understand that psychiatry works differently than a lot of medicine. It's not always about a number on a lab report, and plenty of good psychiatric care never involves a needle at all. But even the prosecution's own final rebuttal witness, Dr. Gregory Sathoff, the forensic psychiatrist from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, who ultimately testified that Clancy was criminally responsible, the same witness the prosecution built its entire closing argument around, agreed under cross-examination that a thyroid test can help with postpartum patients, and confirmed one was never given to her. Think about what that means. The witness the state chose to close its case with still conceded the test should have happened. So you've got doctors on the record saying it should have happened, and doctors on the record saying it isn't strictly required, Both of those things can be true at the same time. What can't be true, what doesn't add up no matter which side you believe, is a woman getting handed 8 new psychiatric medications in 3 weeks with nobody checking what was already in her bloodstream. You don't need a medical degree to feel the gap between those two positions. You just need to picture 8 prescriptions and 0 blood draws sitting next to each other on the same page of a medical record. There's a line from a medical publication that covered this case that I think explains what happened here better than any single missed test does. It described Clancy as a patient with escalating insomnia, medication-driven activation, suicidal thinking, multiple prescribers, emergency care, and a recent hospitalization. And it said that in a situation like that, a patient can become everyone's responsibility and no one's. Read that phrase twice because it's doing a lot of work. Everyone's patient, nobody's clinical owner, a file that everyone touches and nobody keeps. That phrase explains why when Patrick Clancy reached out in late December asking about a higher level of care for his wife, that message went to one provider while Tufts, her own psychiatrist, was somewhere else entirely, out of the loop. Not copied, not informed, simply absent from a conversation about the woman she'd seen 14 times. It explains why a nurse practitioner named Rebecca Gelada, another member of Clancy's care team, testified that she never even found out what diagnosis Clancy ultimately received after being referred somewhere else for more intensive treatment. Gelada admitted she never asked Clancy to sign a release so she could get that information. She said finding it out would have been important. She also said flat out that she never did it, important and undone, both from the same witness in the same breath. Here's a detail that I think most people have heard about this case without ever knowing where it came from. On the morning of January 24th, hours before the killings, Clancy took her daughter Cora to a routine pediatric appointment. The pediatrician who saw Cora that day testified that nothing about the visit raised any concern at all, that it was a completely normal checkup, and that she suggested Cora take Miralax for an upset stomach. That's it. That's the entire origin of the CVS errand. The one detail the prosecution has leaned on hardest as proof of premeditation. The idea that Clancy calculated a window of time by researching the drive to CV's and to a restaurant for takeout started as a pediatrician's completely ordinary suggestion for a toddler's stomachache made by a doctor who, like almost everyone else treating this family, had no idea what was happening inside that house. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that timeline doesn't look calculated, because on its face, it does. The prosecution built a real argument out of it, and juries are allowed to draw their own conclusions from a sequence of errands and search history. But it matters, at least to me, that the thing setting the whole afternoon in motion wasn't some sinister plan taking shape in a vacuum. It was a routine medical suggestion made by yet another provider operating with zero visibility into what the rest of Clancy's care team had already flagged. One more person in this story who didn't know what everyone else knew. And that brings me to the gap that honestly bothers me more than almost anything else in this case. New mothers are typically seen by their obgyn for a checkup around 6 weeks after giving birth. Callan was born in August. By the time Clancy's symptoms had turned into a documented psychiatric emergency, that 6-week window had come and gone, and nothing in the record suggests her obstetric provider, someone who had already guided her through 2 previous pregnancies and presumably knew her baseline, her ordinary way of being, was ever looped back into her care as things got worse. A perinatal psychiatrist who studies exactly this gap told reporters this year that psychiatry residents and OB-GYNs alike typically get no required training in reproductive mental health, and that the healthcare system around new mothers is, in her own words, fractured. Pediatricians see the baby. Obstetric providers see the mother once early on and then step back. Psychiatrists and nurse practitioners rotate in based on referrals and insurance and whoever has an opening that week. nobody owns the whole picture. Nobody is required to. That's not a flaw in one hospital's paperwork. That's the design of the system a new mother in crisis is handed, whether she lives in Duxbury, Massachusetts, or anywhere else with the same patchwork of specialists who each see one slice of her and none of them the whole. Let me back up for a second because I think it's worth naming what this isn't. This isn't a case where one doctor made one bad call on one bad day. It's not even really a case about one hospital. It's 14 visits with a psychiatrist who barely spoke to the family. It's a nurse practitioner switching medications within days of prescribing them. It's a hospital that drew blood and never checked it. It's an obgyn who simply vanished from the timeline after the 6-week mark. Every single link in that chain, on its own, might be defensible, might even be ordinary, the kind of gap that happens in busy medical systems every day without consequence, stacked on top of each other. In the exact 3 weeks before 3 children died, it stops looking like a string of coincidences and starts looking like a system with no one watching the whole board. And that's exactly the argument now sitting in 2 separate civil courtrooms running in parallel with the murder trial. In January of this year, Lindsay Clancy filed her own medical malpractice lawsuit, not as part of her criminal defense, but as a standalone civil complaint against the people who treated her. Days later, Patrick Clancy, her ex-husband, the father of the 3 children she's accused of killing, filed his own wrongful death and malpractice lawsuit against an overlapping list of providers. 2 lawsuits, one from the mother facing murder charges, one from the father who lost his children, both aimed at the same medical system, filed within days of each other by 2 people who otherwise stand on opposite sides of everything. Think about how rare that is in any tragedy for the 2 people who suffered the most to end up pointing at the same third party without ever coordinating with one another. The defendants named across the 2 complaints include Dr. Jennifer Tufts, nurse practitioners Rebecca Gelada and Julie Paul, a therapist named Letitia Dukes, Astor Mental Health, South Shore Health, McLean Hospital, and Women and Infants Hospital of Rhode Island, along with additional psychiatrists brought into her care at different points. That's a long list of names for one patient's file. Dr. Tufts has denied any wrongdoing, and her attorneys have asked the court to convene a medical malpractice tribunal, an early review panel made up of a judge, a physician from the same specialty, and an attorney, whose job is simply to decide if there's enough evidence for the case to move forward at all. That alone tells you Tufts and her legal team are taking this seriously enough to try to end it before it really begins. A tribunal like that isn't a formality lawyers file out of habit. It's a request to have a judge and a fellow physician look at the evidence early and decide whether it's even worth a full trial. Clancy's own complaint leans on 2 outside experts, a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Margaret Spinelli and a forensic psychologist named Dr. Paul Zeisel, who concluded that repeated antidepressant changes, multiple prescribers who weren't coordinating with each other, and a failure to recognize what they believe was underlying bipolar disorder combined to produce what they call a medication-exacerbated psychotic episode. Her experts argue that when Clancy told her providers about intrusive thoughts, nobody dug deep enough into what she meant by that phrase, and that those thoughts may have already been auditory symptoms that got filed away as ordinary postpartum anxiety instead, treated as a mood problem when it may have already become something else entirely. Through the lawsuit, she's seeking compensation for medical bills, lost income, pain and suffering, her permanent paralysis from the fall, and almost unbearably to even say out loud, damages for the lifelong loss of her relationship with the 3 children she's accused of killing. I want to be careful here because these are civil claims. None of the allegations against these providers have been proven, and legal experts who've looked at the filings say this kind of malpractice case is genuinely hard to win because it almost always comes down to a fight between competing expert opinions about what the accepted standard of care really was at the time. The providers being sued are expected to argue that Clancy's mental illness existed long before any of them ever met her, that they inherited a crisis rather than created one. That's a real defense, not a technicality, and it's the kind of defense that has won cases like this before. A jury somewhere down the line may well believe it, but step back and look at what it means that this is even happening at the same time as the murder trial. A woman accused of killing her own children is in a separate courtroom, formally arguing that the medical system failed her first. Her ex-husband, the man who lost Cora and Dawson and Callan, is making functionally the same argument against many of the same providers. Two people standing on opposite sides of the worst thing either of them will ever live through, who will probably never agree on another fact about that day for the rest of their lives, and on this one specific point, they agree with each other. I keep coming back to that 6-week window. It's not a footnote buried somewhere in a filing. It's the stretch of time where a trained obstetric provider, someone who had already walked Clancy through 2 prior pregnancies, could have been the person to notice something was badly wrong. The one voice in the room who had a baseline to compare her against. Instead, that window closed with nobody assigned to be watching for it, and by the time anyone was paying close attention, she'd already been through 14 psychiatric visits, 9 different medications, a hospitalization, and a care team so disconnected from each other that one of her own providers admitted on the stand she never even found out what Clancy's final diagnosis was. So here's where this leaves us tonight. A jury in Plymouth County is behind closed doors right now, working through 5 verdict options for each of 3 children, trying to decide whether Lindsay Clancy understood right from wrong on January 24th, whether she could have stopped herself, whether 9 months of psychiatric care that never once checked her blood work changed what was happening inside her mind on that particular afternoon. Whatever they decide, and it could come down any day now, it won't touch the 2 civil cases running underneath it, the ones asking a completely different question. Not who's guilty. Who was supposed to be watching, and why weren't they? A guilty verdict closes one file. It doesn't close either of the other 2, and it doesn't answer the question those 2 lawsuits were built to ask. Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one. If you want to follow this case all the way to the verdict and to where these malpractice suits go from here, hit subscribe, because what comes next in both courtrooms is going to be even harder to sit through than what we've already heard.